So the title of today's session is Power Shifts in a Multipolar World. And to understand how the current world works, but especially how it will work in the coming years, I would like to highlight at least three key trends that are shaping the world and will continue to do so in the future. And some of them have already been discussed, but I think they are worth considering once more. The first, of course, is the impact that technology is going to have in the labor force. Here I'm talking about things like robotics and automation and the threats that they will present to the middle class around the world. And I am talking not only about low-skilled and middle-skilled workers, but also, according to some research, even to high-skilled workers. And how this will have an economic impact, because when the middle class no longer has purchasing power, the whole economy suffers, but also a political impact, because we have seen that when the middle class is scared about the future, they vote to politicians that promise a shortcut to development and to solve all the problems in a magic way. The second trend that is shaping the world and will be particularly important in the future is demographic change. We know that across the board, life expectancy is rising, whereas at the same time, birth rates are also dropping. And this happens across the board. Of course, in some places like Europe, we have very, very low fertility rates, around 1.3 children per woman in a country like Greece or Germany, which means that there are not enough babies to have a permanent population. But even in Africa or in South Asia, they are dropping from a higher place, of course, but they are dropping across the world. So, according to some projections, by the middle of the century, there will be more people older than 60 years than people younger than 14 years, which means that countries, governments will have massive economic threats. They will have to deal with a pension system that will have to be redesigned. They will have to deal with fewer workers paying work-related taxes and contributing to the budgets of their countries. And of course, this is connected to the previous trends, because in a context of fewer workers, companies and governments will push for technological advance, which at the same time will threaten some jobs. So this is a vicious circle. And of course, the third trend that we have to consider is that global trade is slowing down. The pace of growth of global trade is slowing down, especially if we compare it to the 1990s or even to the early 2000s. And this is connected to many factors. Of course, China is a big issue. China is more and more producing the goods it consumes and consuming the goods it produces. So China's impact in the world and in the growth of global trade is not what it used to be. But there are other issues as well. Of course, tariffs can't go much lower. Transportation costs can't go much lower, but there's also a political component, and previous speakers have already discussed it. Around the world, hundreds and thousands of workers feel threatened by global trade, by free trade, and they are voting for politicians that are promising to protect them from global trade. And you may be asking, why am I mentioning this at a forum in Greece? Well, that's because in many ways Europe is and will be at the epicenter of these trends. As I said before, Europe has some of the lowest fertility rates in the world. There's a growing number of Europeans who are against the free movement of people in particular, but also against the free movement of goods, capital and services, which is a very threatening thing for the European Union, because those are the very same principles upon which the European Union was created. And I have to be positive and say, of course, there are some solutions, there are some ways to address this. Education is one way. The introduction of technology in the workforce does not necessarily mean that all jobs will be disrupted. You can teach people, you can train people to control that technology and to work with that technology, but not every country, not every government will have the resources or even the desire to do that. Considering demographic change, of course, some countries will continue to attract immigrants to try to rejuvenate their labor force. To a certain extent, that's what Germany did last year. They imported 1 million young Syrian workers. But of course, we know that it comes at a high political price, because the local population often feel threatened about the newcomers and vote for people who promise that they will cut immigration. So everything that could be said has a downside. And as Ambassador Christidis said before me, 2017 is the year that in Europe we will see many of these trends at play. Because Germany is holding a general election, but it's not Germany that I am particularly worried about. France, the second largest economy in Europe, will hold an election, and if opinion polls are to be trusted, the French presidential system, which was designed to be very stable and to prevent extremists from taking over, will work its magic once again, and even if the National Front gets 40–45% of the votes, the moderates should remain in power. But that means that at least 4 out of 10, or maybe 5 out of 10 French voters are willing to support a party that is openly saying we should leave the Eurozone. And after France, of course, comes Italy. Italy is going to hold an election maybe later this year, maybe early next year. And if you take a look at the polls, 2 of the 3 largest political parties in Europe, in Italy, sorry, are proposing a referendum on Eurozone membership. So the thing about Europe is that even if the current problems are avoided, even if the current election cycle does not bring about the rise of the nationalists, it's a matter of time. How long before the next election? How long before the next crisis? So this is a time for the European Union to think about its future. We have seen yesterday the European Commission releasing a white paper proposing a series of alternatives and roads it could take in the coming years. There are basically 2 options. Option number 1 is more integration, moving in the direction of what the founding fathers called the federal system, the United States of Europe. At this point, that sounds very unlikely. We are seeing fragmentation. We are seeing that the nation state refuses to go away. And the process of European integration has reached a point where the next step in the process would involve a massive transfer of national sovereignty to unelected institutions in Brussels, and things like the creation of a system to distribute wealth from the north of Europe to the south, or systems to create a system to share risk in the banking sector or to share risk in issuing debt, for instance, are very sensitive, and it's not a given that all the member states will accept to do it. And of course, the other way is also included in the white paper that the Commission published yesterday, and it's about finding a way to let some countries develop further and in the integration while others are left behind. This seems to be the way forward, but of course it's not taken for granted that it will work. It's not taken for granted that by trying to dismantle some elements of the European Union, the whole system will survive. And I will finish with just one more reflection. When European leaders talk to each other and think about the future of Europe, they have to keep 2 things in mind. The European Union was built under 2 promises: the promise of peace in Europe and the promise of economic prosperity. Thank God it still delivers on the former. There is still peace in Europe, and that will continue to be the case for a very long time. But the question of prosperity is no longer taken for granted, and that's exactly what the European leaders should be thinking about in the coming years.
Thank you.